The lobby of the luxury hotel was alive with the hum of voices and the soft clinking of glasses as guests mingled, dressed in their finest attire. Warren Buffett sat in an unassuming corner, dressed simply, sipping a cup of tea. The world's richest man, yet he blended in so seamlessly that few even noticed him. He liked it that way. It allowed him to observe people in their natural state, without the pretense that often followed his name. The doors of the lobby opened with a faint whoosh, and in walked a man who immediately caught everyone's attention, but not in the way Warren usually did. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his shoes scuffed beyond repair. He looked exhausted, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every step required effort. A small bag hung from his shoulder, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. The man approached the front desk, clutching the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The receptionist glanced at him, her smile faltering before she plastered it back on, though it lacked any real warmth. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. I was wondering if—" The man's voice was weak, barely audible over the background noise of the lobby. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need some help. Just a place to sit for a while." The receptionist hesitated, her eyes quickly scanning the man's appearance. A flash of discomfort crossed her face, but she kept her tone even. "Sir, this is a private hotel. We can't allow loitering." "I'm not loitering," the man said, his voice trembling. I've been walking all day. I'm so tired." Before the receptionist could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "If he's not a guest, he shouldn't be here." It was a guest standing nearby, a man in a tailored suit who looked at the exhausted newcomer with open disdain. Others around him nodded or murmured in agreement, their eyes narrowing as they judged the man. Warren watched from his corner, his cup of tea forgotten. His eyes moved from the poor man to the others in the lobby, observing their reactions. There was a mix of discomfort, indifference, and even annoyance. But no one moved to help. The man swayed slightly, his hand gripping the counter tighter as his knees seemed to buckle. "Please," he said softly, almost a whisper now. "I just need a moment." And then, without warning, he collapsed to the floor. Gasps echoed through the lobby, and the receptionist stepped back instinctively, her face a mask of shock. For a moment, no one moved. The suited man from earlier muttered something under his breath, shaking his head, while others whispered among themselves. But no one stepped forward. Warren stood up slowly, placing his cup on the table beside him. His eyes narrowed as he made his way toward the fallen man, the murmurs around him growing louder with each step. Warren reached the man just as a faint groan escaped his lips. He knelt down, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. The poor man's face was pale, his breathing shallow, and his clothes damp with sweat. Warren gently placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke softly. "Hey, can you hear me? You're going to be all right." The receptionist stood frozen, unsure of what to do. A few guests had gathered nearby, their curiosity piqued, but none of them offered help. Instead, they whispered amongst themselves, their voices tinged with judgment. "He shouldn't have been here in the first place," someone muttered, and another added, "Probably looking for handouts." Warren turned his head slightly, his piercing gaze silencing the whispers. "Can someone bring him some water?" he asked firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. But no one moved. The staff exchanged hesitant glances, clearly unsure whether to act. "I said water," Warren repeated, his tone now carrying an unmistakable authority. This time, a young bellhop broke from the group, nodding nervously and rushing off to fetch a bottle. Warren turned his attention back to the man, who was beginning to stir. "Take it easy," he said gently. "Just focus on breathing. Help is coming." The manager of the hotel arrived moments later, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His eyes flicked between Warren and the collapsed man, his expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was more worried about the scene causing a disruption than the man's well-being. Warren didn't look up. "This man collapsed. He needs help," he said simply. The bellhop returned with a bottle of water, and Warren took it, carefully tilting it to the man's lips. The manager cleared his throat. "Sir, I understand the concern, but this is a private establishment. If he's not a guest—" Warren raised a hand, silencing him. "He's a human being," he said evenly, his calm tone carrying more weight than any shout. "That's all that should matter right now." The man's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. He tried to speak, but his words came out in a hoarse whisper. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Warren said firmly. "You're just tired. Rest for a moment." The crowd around them grew, but the atmosphere was still thick with unease. Warren could feel the judgment in the air, the unspoken question of why he, a man of his status, would bother with someone like this. He didn't care. The man needed help, and that was all that mattered. Warren glanced up at the manager, his eyes sharp. "Call an ambulance," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The manager hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, pulling out his phone. As Warren returned his focus to the man, he couldn't help but notice the murmurs continuing around him. "Why is he so invested?" a woman whispered to her companion. "Do you think he knows him?" Warren ignored them, but the faintest hint of a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. If they only knew who he was, the shock on their faces would be priceless. The ambulance arrived quickly, its flashing lights casting sharp reflections on the polished marble of the hotel lobby. Paramedics rushed in, their presence breaking the uncomfortable stillness that had taken over the room. Warren stepped aside to give them space, but stayed close, watching as they assessed the man's condition. "Dehydration and exhaustion," one of the paramedics muttered to the other. "Probably hasn't eaten in a while." They began preparing to lift the man onto a stretcher, their movements swift and practiced. The manager stood to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His discomfort was obvious, and he kept glancing at Warren, as if trying to gauge his reaction. "It seems he'll be fine," the manager said finally, his tone stiff. "Perhaps we can move him outside to avoid further disruptions for our guests." Warren turned to him slowly, his expression calm, but his voice carrying an edge. "Outside?" he repeated. "This man collapsed in your hotel. You're worried about disruption, but you should be worried about why no one here thought to help him before I stepped in." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but quickly shut it again, under Warren's withering gaze. The gathered crowd murmured softly, some now shifting uncomfortably. A few seemed to realize the weight of the situation, while others still looked on with disapproval. As the paramedics prepared to leave, Warren stepped forward and spoke to the man. "They're taking you to the hospital. Don't worry about the cost. I'll cover it." The man's eyes, still glassy, but now filled with tears, locked onto Warren. "Why?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Why would you do that for me?" Warren crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one should be treated the way you were tonight." As the stretcher was wheeled out, Warren straightened and turned to the crowd, his voice calm but commanding. I've spent my life learning about value. What matters? What doesn't? Let me tell you this. A person's worth isn't measured by the clothes they wear or the money in their pocket. It's in their humanity, something I've seen too little of tonight. The guests were silent, their earlier whispers replaced by an awkward, heavy quiet. The manager shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, his face reddening. As the lobby emptied out, Warren began to walk toward the exit, but before he reached the door, he stopped, turning back to the manager. You might want to reconsider how you treat people who come through these doors, he said, his voice steady but firm. You never know who they might be, or what they might mean to someone else. With that, he adjusted his jacket, walking out into the night as the paramedics drove away. The lobby was left in stunned silence, the echoes of his words hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. The manager stood frozen in the lobby, his face a mixture of embarrassment and unease. The whispers among the guests had turned into murmurs of realization, some of them exchanging guilty glances as they replayed the scene in their minds. A guest near the front desk broke the silence. Who was that man, really? The one who helped? She asked, her voice hushed but curious. The receptionist, who had been equally dismissive earlier, shifted awkwardly. I'm not sure, she admitted. But the look in her eyes suggested she was beginning to understand there was more to Warren than met the eye. Outside, Warren walked slowly down the snowy street, his thoughts lingering on the man he'd just helped. He wasn't angry. He had seen this kind of judgment before, time and time again. But he couldn't ignore the knot of frustration in his chest at how quickly people had written off a man in need, all because of his appearance. As he reached the corner, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a message from one of his assistants. Everything okay? Heard you're at the hotel. Warren chuckled softly, shaking his head. News traveled fast in his world. I'll explain later, he typed back, slipping the phone into his pocket. He wasn't ready to talk about what had just happened, but he knew it wasn't over. The night had planted a seed, a moment of reflection that he intended to grow into something bigger. Back inside the hotel, the manager paced near the front desk, still shaken. The realization of who Warren might be was slowly dawning on him, but he couldn't quite piece it together. He turned to the receptionist, his voice low but urgent. Did he leave any details? A name? Anything? The receptionist hesitated, then shook her head. No, but he seemed so familiar. I just can't place him. One of the guests, who had been quietly observing the interaction, leaned in. Whoever he is, she said, her tone sharp. He just reminded all of us what kindness looks like. Maybe you should think about why he had to. The manager flinched at her words, but he didn't reply. Instead, he walked back to his office, his mind racing. He needed to figure out who this man was, and why his words lingered so heavily in the air. Meanwhile, Warren continued walking, the hotel fading into the distance behind him. Snowflakes danced in the streetlights, and the quiet of the night felt almost peaceful. He adjusted his coat and glanced at the warm light spilling from the windows of a nearby cafe. Deciding he could use a moment to reflect, he stepped inside. As he sat down with a cup of coffee, he thought about the man in the ambulance, his weak smile of gratitude as he was wheeled away. Warren's actions hadn't been extraordinary, at least not to him. But the way people had reacted, the hesitance, the judgment, the surprise, it spoke volumes about the world he lived in. He sipped his coffee, his thoughts turning to what he could do next. Tonight had been a moment of clarity, a stark reminder that wealth and power meant nothing if they weren't used to lift others. The poor man's story deserved more than a fleeting act of kindness. It deserved attention, action, and change. Warren leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had a plan forming, one that would ensure the lesson of tonight reached far beyond a single hotel lobby. The world needed to do better, and he was in a position to make sure it did. The next morning, the hotel lobby was unusually quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of guests checking out and staff shuffling between tasks had been replaced by a tense stillness. The events of the previous night lingered in everyone's minds, especially the manager's. He sat in his office, scrolling through the hotel's security footage, trying to make sense of what had happened. As he watched the video, his heart sank. There it was. His hesitation, the staff's reluctance, the guests' judgmental whispers, and then the calm presence of the man who had stepped in, taking control of the situation with quiet authority. The more he watched, the more familiar the man seemed, but it wasn't until he froze the frame on Warren's face that it hit him. "No," the manager whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He pulled up his phone and searched for Warren Buffett. A dozen images popped up, and there it was, the same unassuming man who had walked into his hotel the night before, wearing a modest coat and a kind expression. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had dismissed, even disrespected, one of the most powerful and respected men in the world. His face flushed with embarrassment as he replayed Warren's words in his mind. "You might want to reconsider how you treat people who come through these doors." Meanwhile, across town, Warren sat in a small conference room with his team. He had called an early meeting, his expression serious but focused. "I want to find out everything about the man from last night," he said, his tone firm. "Where he came from, what happened to him, and how we can help." One of his assistants nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll start with the hospital records. They should have his details." "Good," Warren replied. "And once we have that, I want to make sure his story gets out. People need to see what happens when we let assumptions and prejudice guide our actions." The team exchanged glances, their respect for Warren evident. He wasn't just a man of wealth. He was a man of conviction, someone who used his influence to challenge the world to be better. By midday, Warren had all the information he needed. The man, James Carter, was a former construction worker who had lost his job after an injury. Without insurance, he had been unable to pay his medical bills, which eventually led to him losing his home. He had been wandering the streets for weeks, surviving on whatever scraps he could find, until he collapsed in the hotel lobby. Warren's jaw tightened as he read the report. "This isn't just about James," he said quietly. "It's about a system that lets people like him fall through the cracks." He turned to his team. "I want a public statement drafted. We're going to highlight James's story and call for action. And make sure the hotel is included. I want them to know this isn't about shaming them. It's about waking them up." The statement went live that evening, accompanied by a video of Warren recounting the events of the previous night. His words were calm, but powerful. His message clear. Compassion isn't optional. It's what defines us as human beings. If we can't see past appearances, then we've lost something far more valuable than money or status. We've lost our humanity. The video quickly went viral, sparking conversations across social media and news outlets. People shared their own stories of prejudice and judgment, while others praised Warren for using his platform to advocate for change. At the hotel, the staff watched the video in stunned silence. The manager, still reeling from the realization of who Warren was, felt a wave of shame and determination wash over him. He gathered his team and made an announcement. They would be implementing mandatory training on inclusivity and compassion, effective immediately. As for James, he woke up in the hospital to find a letter from Warren waiting for him. Inside was a promise to cover his medical bills, along with an invitation to meet once he recovered. James held the letter tightly, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in years, he felt seen, valued, and hopeful. A few days later, James sat nervously in a modest meeting room. He had been discharged from the hospital the day before, and now he was waiting to meet the man who had saved him. When the door opened, Warren Buffett walked in, wearing the same simple attire he'd worn at the hotel. His warm smile immediately put James at ease. "James," Warren said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you up and moving." James stood, shaking Warren's hand firmly. "Mr. Buffett, I don't even know how to thank you. You've done more for me than anyone ever has." Warren gestured for him to sit. "You don't need to thank me," he said, taking a seat across from James. "I just did what anyone should have done. But your story opened my eyes to something bigger. You reminded me how much work we have to do as a society." James looked down, his voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone cared. People walked past me for weeks like I didn't exist." Warren nodded, his expression serious. "That's why your story matters, James. It's not just about you or me. It's about showing people what happens when we stop seeing each other as human beings." Warren reached into his jacket and handed James a folder. "Inside, you'll find everything you need to get back on your feet. A job offer with one of my companies, housing assistance, and a plan to help you rebuild. But there's one condition." James blinked, overwhelmed. "Anything," he said quickly. Warren's gaze softened. "When you're back on your feet, I want you to pay it forward. Help someone else who feels invisible. Be the person you wish you'd had during your hardest times." James swallowed hard, nodding as tears filled his eyes. "I promise." As the meeting wrapped up, Warren stood and patted James on the shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, James. This isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning." The video of Warren's actions and his meeting with James continued to circulate online, sparking a wave of discussions about compassion, inequality, and the importance of stepping up for those in need. Across the country, people began sharing stories of their own struggles and acts of kindness, inspired by what they had seen. Back at the hotel, the manager and staff began their inclusivity training, each of them reflecting on their actions that night. The lesson was clear. It wasn't about who someone was or what they looked like. It was about how they made others feel. Warren's words had left a mark, one they wouldn't forget. As Warren walked out of the meeting room, the sun was shining brightly, and the world outside felt a little more hopeful. He adjusted his coat, a faint smile on his lips. For all his wealth, it was moments like this, acts of kindness and connection, that reminded him of what mattered most. And as he walked away, James sat quietly with the folder in his hands, a new sense of purpose filling his heart. He knew he wouldn't let Warren down.